Social media is a huge part of everyone's life, and it has only been popularized even more in the last several years. For instance, 4.48 billion people use social media as of 2021. This represents about 61% of the roughly 7.87 billion world population. Social media dates back longer than you may think. The first piece of social media was introduced to the world in 1844 by inventor Samuel Morse. This piece of equipment was known as the telegraph. Much later, in 1991, came the release of the World Wide Web, a huge advancement. The first main social media sites were known as Classmates.com and 6degrees.com. These sites were a lot more primitive than the communication we have available today. Today, the world is overstuffed with several different sites to interact with friends over. A few of the most popular social media sites include Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. Social media is bigger than ever today. Most teens spend all of their time on their phone. A Pew Research Center study found that 75% of adults use social media in 2020. In 2021, this same center found that YouTube was the most popular platform, followed closely behind by Facebook.
I would say I spend more time on social media, unfortunately. Usually it's about, on average, like 6 to 8 hours a day, because I can check how much time I do on my phone. Yeah, I mostly spend my social media time on YouTube, Instagram, Reddit.
I spend about half and half time on social media, half time in person. I don't really communicate through social media. I prefer to do that in person. I use social media for purely entertainment purposes.
Over the last few years, people's preferences for in-person communication has decreased. A study by Common Sense Media in 2012 found that 49% of people prefer in-person communication over 33% who prefer texting. Only 6 years later, in 2018, the same survey was conducted. This new survey found that 35% of people prefer texting, while 32% of people prefer in-person communication.
In terms of interacting with people, I would say more face-to-face, because I mostly use social media just to watch things or for entertainment purposes, but in terms of interacting with people, I do that at school all the time, at work.
I would say I'd spend more time over social media as of now. I would say before this whole COVID thing hit, I definitely spent more time in face-to-face.
One of the largest events of the last several years came with the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic starting in 2020. This pandemic led to a very strict quarantine. Businesses and schools have resorted to conducting their meetings over several different sources, such as Zoom, Microsoft Teams, or even Discord.
Oh, the pandemic has definitely made me a lot less social. I mean, that's allowed me to stay inside nonstop. Helps me just do a lot more over the phone, Zoom calls, virtual meetings. I don't really do any more face-to-face at all, actually.
The pandemic had a weird effect on my social life and how I socialize. The pandemic cut off so much. I remember it was hardest in the beginning with communicating with people. You're just trapped in the house with only the people you live with. And I was lucky enough to actually have a decently full house to not feel completely stifled of communication. But I definitely think it had an impact on the relationships I had with people outside of the home, because it just made me not use social media at all to communicate with them. And that was the primary way of communicating back in high school, right before the pandemic started. So it had an interesting effect on my socialization.
Definitely less social. When the pandemic hit, I pretty much lost contact with, everyone, since, due to virtual classes, I couldn't go to school, talk with friends there. I wasn't able to talk to the kids on my sports teams. I basically just had no one. I just kind of spent most of the time by myself taking virtual classes. So, and when face-to-face restrictions came back, I had a hard time talking to my friends face-to-face because I just wasn't used to it.
Probably the hardest thing is the engagement, like getting the students to engage and getting the feedback by having to use a device of some sort. So good devices are going to then have to depend on connectivity with your Wi-Fi or your internet, and then is the device capable of conducting the meeting, and do they have the software available to run the meeting? So if we use Teams, Microsoft Teams, and so you would need to have good internet at your house, you would have to have the computer device working well, and then you're going to want to have the meeting scheduled. You need to show up, but I really think it's important that the teacher's using some sort of teaching style that engages the students as well.
I definitely was not a fan of it. I had a horrible time paying attention over virtual classes because I took them at home. So I would just have so many distractions. I would always be on my phone playing video games during my classes. I just couldn't pay attention, especially because I didn't have my camera on, so I didn't really have anyone pressuring me to pay attention to my classes. And me not paying attention, I would definitely do poorly on some assignments, so I got worse grades. And just not being in a school, I lost a lot of social interaction that I definitely needed, so definitely negatively.
I like virtual learning for the flexibility that it gives me for my schedule. But as far as the learning process goes, it's not the most enjoyable thing. You definitely feel cut off from everybody else. It's not the same. The engagement level is not as great. It's not an in-depth conversation that you'd probably like to have, especially for, those kinds of classes that you might be most interested in. It takes away from making new friends or meeting new people. So it's definitely kind of stifling in that aspect. But I appreciate the flexibility.
There are huge differences between in-person and online communication. Many nonverbal and physical cues can be found within in-person communication. People might try to use emojis or word shorteners like LOL or OMG to express different emotions that they can't over the phone. People are capable of thinking over what they want to say in a text. Meanwhile, when people are communicating in person with each other, they have less time to think of what they want to say, and they can't take their words back.
That happens all the time. I think that happens to everybody because you can't read facial expressions in a text message or body language or tone. You can't read those things through just plain writing. So I think it's easy to misinterpret what someone's trying to say or someone to misinterpret what I'm trying to say. But luckily now we have emojis to kind of help with understanding what people mean or what they're trying to say. And sometimes a lot of people have to literally write out. I recall reading Reddit posts, and a lot of people are sarcastic on Reddit. And I'm not very good at reading sarcasm, so I can't tell if someone genuinely means what they're saying or if they're just joking. So that's kind of the downside of mediated communication.
I'd say all the time, definitely. I think talking over text, I don't know, I'm not really a fan of it because you can just easily misinterpret stuff. I misinterpret stuff all the time. And sometimes I would say something over text and I guess people really wouldn't know what I mean, so they might be offended or something. I can't really be sarcastic or anything over text. I just type the words and they would think I'm being serious, so they would get offended or stuff like that. I mean, just times where I would text some of my friends over social media or something like that. I would say something sarcastically, but they would take it seriously and kind of get annoyed at me. So I would have to explain that it was just a joke or it was sarcastic.
That is one thing. Sarcasm is not implied. So in text, and even in text messages or in emails, if you don't state how it's read, then the interpretation that you're going to get of it is similar. Same thing with having the cameras on or not having the cameras on. Well, a good thing to do is to not use written communication, but actually do a direct phone call, or if it was possible to have them in person, visit them in person, because you're going to hear tone, you're going to hear intent, and you're going to clarify any problems that happen. But that does happen a lot. Again, sarcasm is not implied. Some people take something, any sentence that you say, I didn't say that, could be, I didn't say that, or I didn't say that. I mean, you can't interpret what you think the text is supposed to say, I guess, unless you tell the audience, this is the response I want you to have to what I'm about to tell you.
I mean, the one thing I know is that human beings are tribal creatures, right? We're herd animals, so to speak, and I think that we need other people. People don't do well on their own or in isolation. So I've seen plenty of reports where, depression has gone up, incidents of suicidal ideations have gone up just because of the social isolation brought on by quarantine and the pandemic. And I think with kids too, because like a lot of grade school and high school kids were kept home in pretty formative years where I think they really need that interaction with their peer groups. And it's been a confusing and for some a debilitating time. You know, and I've even seen that with my own nephews who are now 16 and 18, where they missed out on, you know, a year and a half of their high school experience. And some of the landmark events, like even some college or high school seniors who didn't get to graduate in the traditional sense. Like, you know, they walked in as freshmen with that expectation. They saw all the people who went before them kind of go through those rites of passage, and they were denied that because of the pandemic. So, yeah, I think it's definitely had an impact.
Over time, the pandemic has slowed down and both students and teachers have returned to learning in person. However, online learning is still offered in many different places. People are unique and different. Some people prefer online, while others prefer speaking face-to-face.
Ooh, out of the two, I definitely prefer face-to-face. I think face-to-face allows you to read people's expressions, their body language, and actually become better friends with them if you're in person talking to them face-to-face.
Definitely talking to people face-to-face. I think social interaction is very important, especially face-to-face. And due to my major here, it's a business that I'm getting into that requires a lot of social interaction. So I think talking to people on a regular basis is better for me. And you know,
I prefer talking to people face to face. I don't talk to people online. And I think that's just the result of the pandemic. I just don't do it that much anymore, or really at all anymore. Just face-to-face communication, it just works for me. I just love having that in-person, real social interaction.